Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share cryptid encounters where people aren't exactly sure what they saw. These stories include a person who had a scary experience while camping with their family, along with physical evidence left at the scene, a young man who encountered an evil presence while exploring the forest with his friends that he believes was hunting him, and someone who encountered a being they described as having a face with human-like features. But first, we start with one of the best stories I've come across in a long time, where a police officer and his partner have a terrifying experience one night. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who is a police officer. He and his partner were out on patrol one night when they had a terrifying experience. He does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that it happened back in October of 2020. The original poster, or OP, and his partner had a spot where they parked their patrol vehicles, a quiet dirt road leading to an abandoned school. He says they only used the spot for night shifts when things started to wind down, which was usually around 1 a.m. It was the perfect place to catch up on paperwork or indulge in some YouTube videos without further disturbances. However, the seemingly peaceful location has given them their fair share of strange experiences. This includes strange lights darting through the woods and even a possible UFO sighting. To top it off, they even stumbled upon an unidentified body there years before their encounter. Finding the body still sends shivers down his spine, but that's not even the most bone-chilling part of this story. Their encounter took place on a chilly October night in 2020 at around 2 a.m. Crime rates were low that night, partially due to COVID and partially because of the cold weather. They were in their usual spot where their patrol vehicles parked side by side facing opposite directions, so their driver's side windows were aligned. This arrangement is a common practice in their line of work, according to the OP. His partner eventually got a call for a noise complaint and left, leaving the OP alone. He took the opportunity to step out and answer nature's call. As he was standing outside, he heard a haunting whistle echo through the woods next to the abandoned school grounds. The sound originated from approximately 100 yards away, sending a chill down his spine. He describes it as a tune, unmistakably human-like but oddly loud. Although homelessness is a problem in his city, it isn't an issue in the area where he patrols. This led him to assuming that a wanderer must have found their way to the south side of the city. Growing anxious, he quickly retreated to the safety of his car and rolled up the window, eagerly awaiting the return of his partner. About 20 minutes passed before his partner finally rejoined him. He recounted the incident, telling his partner about the eerie whistle, fully aware of his skepticism toward the paranormal. After telling his partner, they moved on to other topics. Within 30 minutes, his partner exited his vehicle to answer nature's call. In a matter of seconds of him stepping into the woods, they heard it again. A loud whistle, this time resembling a slow, haunting melody, piercing the night air, lingering for about 10 seconds. The OP's partner returned to where the patrol cars were parked, his face drained of all color, leaving it a pale milky white. He says being that they were policemen, they decided to investigate the strange noise. Grabbing their flashlights, they cautiously made their way through the field, the tall grass reaching up to their waists. They made it about halfway across the field when they heard the whistle again, this time coming from the direction of the school to their right. They turned and shined their lights toward the school, but soon noticed the grass starting to move. He points out here that there was absolutely no wind. Besides, it looked as if something was crawling toward them within the grass. With their hands on their firearms, they slowly approached the moving grass. The air was still and cold, so cold that they could see their own breath. The OP could tell his partner was clearly uneasy as they walked quietly toward the sound. When they were about 20 feet from whatever this thing was, the grass suddenly stopped moving and they once again heard the whistle coming from where their flashlights were shining. They stood there frozen in fear, too afraid to speak. He says here that it felt like minutes passed, but everything probably happened in a matter of seconds. He managed to take a step forward and the grass started moving again, this time away from them toward the tree line. He says it was moving way too fast for them to even think about giving chase, so they just stood and watched. When it reached the woods, they heard the whistle again, but this time it was quiet. This is the part that gave them both quite a shock. They had their light shining on the spot where whatever this was stopped and saw a figure stand up. He described it as looking like a child, but there was something off about it. He says it is difficult to explain exactly what it looked like. Keeping their lights pointed on whatever this thing was, their beams lit up several large trees behind it. Before they could call out, the figure disappeared behind a tree and into the forest. Gathering their courage, they went to investigate, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no sound of leaves crunching, nothing. It was as if the figure had vanished into thin air. They returned to their patrol cars and spent the next hour checking to see if there were any missing child reports in the area. But they found nothing. He says the creepiest part was that it had to have been running on all fours when it was in the grass. He also says there is a children's psychiatric hospital in the city where he lives and works, but there were no reports of any of the children there going missing or escaping. To this day, they cannot explain what they saw that night. However, they continued to park in that spot. They have yet to have another experience like they did that night. He ends his post by saying that his partner is now a believer and everyone in their department thinks they are crazy. I think the last thing I would want to hear out in a remote location next to an abandoned school, or any other abandoned structure for that matter, would be a haunting whistle in the woods. And not only to keep hearing it, but to have something you can't see come rushing towards you, with the grass parting and moving like that? That would be absolutely terrifying to say the very least. I do wonder why it stopped in front of them without coming any closer though. It's almost like it was just trying to get a good look at them. Because I'm pretty sure if it wanted to attack or try to grab one of them, it would have been able to do so with ease, especially as fast as this thing was said to be moving. I know the two policemen drew their guns, but they seem to be ineffective against cryptids unless they are shot in very specific spots. Many stories document how these creatures are either impervious to the bullets and are unfazed by weapons. Back to this thing just getting close enough to get a better look. I've actually seen this in a lot of these encounters, where the cryptid just wants to get a closer look at the people involved. They seem to be fascinated with us for one reason or another. Now, as far as what I think this thing is, the whistling makes me think Wendigo. However, I will say that there are other cryptids that are known for this as well. What makes me think this was not a Wendigo is the fact that it didn't attack. Wendigo are said to be vicious, cannibalistic hunters, and the description he gave of this thing. He said it looked like a child when it ran off into the woods. This makes me wonder if this was even a cryptid at all. The encounter did take place next to an abandoned school, so maybe this was a spirit or something similar. He also said there was a children's psychiatric hospital nearby, but what child can run like that on all fours with that kind of speed? In any case, this is one that has me a bit baffled. What do you think these two officers encountered out there that night? The next story comes from a poster who had a scary experience while camping with his family when he was younger. He does not say where his story takes place. When the original poster was around 6 or 7 years old, he had heard a lot of talk about Sasquatch. He knew about the creature based on what he had heard, but didn't really believe in cryptids or anything like that. One summer, he and his family went camping and brought a trailer to sleep in. One night during their trip, they were by the campfire, but as the night went on, the OP couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He says the campsite already had an eerie feel, being in the dark woods with nothing but the fire for light. Plus, him being so young, his imagination started putting ideas into his head. He didn't want anyone to know that he was feeling scared, and they didn't seem to notice that he did, He kept it to himself and went to bed. The next morning, he and his family found a huge handprint on the back of their car. He mentions that's where they were keeping their snacks. This spooked everyone there and they took a picture, but unfortunately it was lost. When they got home, they found out that the same campsite they had been to had many Sasquatch sightings the week they were there. Since then, the OP has wanted to find out what was out there. There are so many of these stories that involve the same details during the encounters. One of the ones I see the most also happens in this story, and it is the feeling of being watched. This is a telltale sign that a cryptid is nearby, especially when it lines up with so many of the other details described by the people in these stories. He doesn't outright say he felt a feeling of dread, but he does mention how eerie things felt out in the darkness beyond the light of the campfire and how scared he became when the feeling of being watched settled over him. Not only do we have these details, but there is also physical proof that something was at their campsite due to the large handprint being on the car the next morning. Also, there were other reports of Sasquatch sightings in the area he heard about when he got home. This all points to a cryptid being near and in their campsite for me. As for what it was, being that the area is known for Sasquatch sightings, this seems to be the most logical conclusion. They have been known to not just leave footprints, but also handprints behind, especially on vehicles. All of that said though, it very well could have been something else or even a person with very big hands. Without a sighting and a physical description, I can't say for certain what I think this was, but all signs point to it being a cryptid. What do you think was out there with the OP and his family that night? The next story comes from a poster who took to the online community searching for answers after an encounter he had the day he posted his story online. He dove deep into his research of what this thing could have been after this unsettling encounter, which led him to sharing his story. He mentions that he is still trying to wrap his head around everything that happened. His story takes place in northwestern Pennsylvania. The original poster and a few of his friends went to spend the weekend in a cabin tucked away in the untouched woods of northern Pennsylvania. The only way to get to the cabin is on a gravel road surrounded by 30 acres of pure wilderness. After eating dinner at around 4 or 5 p.m., the group ventured into the woods to explore for a bit. But as they left the driveway behind, an eerie feeling washed over the OP. The forest suddenly became very still with an unsettling silence, only for the normal forest sounds to quickly return seconds later. The forest springing back to life caused the OP to dismiss the uneasy feeling, and he continued into the woods with his friends. However, this is when things took a peculiar turn. As they ventured further into the woods, they stumbled upon some strange animal tracks. He says here that he and his friends are no strangers to animal tracks or the woods, but the ones before them were unlike anything they had ever seen. Some resembled footprints of a mountain lion, but they were deeply imprinted into the dirt, as if left by a creature weighing somewhere between 600 and 700 pounds, as estimated by the OP. The group then came across smaller tracks that bore a striking resemblance to those of a small dog, but something about them felt off. They were too close together to match a dog's stride. Continuing their trek through the forest, they began hearing unusual sounds. The noises were nothing out of the ordinary, but enough to raise an eyebrow. And then, just as they came around a bend in the trail, they heard the loud snapping of wood the OP says could have either been a twig or a branch. His friend's eyes widened as he caught sight of something resembling a mountain lion, but with an odd coloration. But as quickly as it appeared, it vanished from his line of sight. That was their cue to turn tail and hastily make their way back to the safety of their cabin. But here's where things take a sinister turn. As they retraced their steps, an overwhelming sense of malevolence seemed to envelop the OP. He found himself struggling to breathe, his chest growing tight as he began to hyperventilate. This was far from ordinary for him. As they made it to the cabin and went inside, he had an eerie sensation that something was watching him, targeting and even hunting him. He turned and fixed his gaze on a particular patch of dense forest, unable to tear his eyes away from it. The same unsettling energy then washed over his friends as well, but to a lesser degree. It then dawned on them that this mysterious force was circling them, lurking just beyond the cabin's walls. They looked out of one of the bedroom windows and caught a glimpse of a being deep in the woods. Throughout the entire encounter, the OP struggled to breathe and experienced chest pains. After enduring what felt like endless torture for 2 hours, the energy dissipated and released its grip on the surrounding area. The being's energy definitely did not feel like that of a mountain lion, and its appearance seemed off. They didn't hear any noise other than twigs and branches snapping, but they could feel the energy this thing emitted. The experience felt surreal, and he still can't make any sense of it. He's certain whatever this thing wasn't like any living creature he has ever encountered. He ends his post by asking if anyone has any ideas what it could have been and says any information would be helpful. This is far from the first story I've heard where the person having the encounter describes the being's presence as feeling malevolent. And it is also not the first story I've heard where the person feels like they are being hunted. I mentioned earlier in this episode that these creatures seem to be fascinated with us and sometimes approach us with curiosity rather than malicious intent. But the creature in this story, whatever it was definitely malicious in nature. It had ill intent and seemed to hone in on the OP as its prey. What makes me think this was a cryptid and not a mountain lion was the eerie feeling he got when they entered the forest, everything around them falling still and silent, as is described in so many stories, and the evil presence emitted by whatever stalked them through the forest and around their cabin. As for what it was though, that is anyone's guess. The description given by the OP's friend who did actually lay eyes on this being said it looked like a mountain lion, but the color was off. Perhaps it was just a mountain lion, or perhaps whatever this thing was just moving on all fours in a similar manner. Given the description of the presence and the energy this thing emitted, I'm leaning toward this being a cryptid. Big surprise there, huh? What do you think the group encountered in the forest that day? The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster who saw a huge creature one day while out exploring with his friend when he was younger. His story takes place in Tennessee, but he does not give an exact location. The original poster grew up in rural Tennessee where his days were filled with endless adventures in the backcountry alongside friends. They would venture out into the wilderness on hikes, covering miles of terrain each day. Their usual group consisted of 4 explorers, but on this fateful day, it was just the OP and one of his friends. At the time, the friend that was accompanying him that day had recently relocated from California with his family about a year prior to the events of this story. As the 2 boys ventured deeper into the countryside, they carefully concealed their bikes and set out across the hills. Hours passed as they trekked through the forest, laughing and playing as usual. But then his friend, who was very animated and talked a lot and very fast, suddenly fell silent. A sense of unease washed over the OP as he turned to face him, only to be met with a look of sheer terror. His gaze was fixed on something behind him. He briefly pointed before sprinting in the opposite direction. Fear gripped the OP, but despite his trepidation, curiosity compelled him to turn around. What he saw standing there was beyond his comprehension, a towering, hairy figure that emitted a putrid odor. It had the appearance of a Sasquatch, but the OP says he was hesitant to call it that because it ran like a dog. Having grown up and lived in a rural area his whole life, he was well versed in the sounds and behaviors of bears, and he can confidently say that what he encountered that day was not a bear. Bears have distinct sounds and running styles that differ from dogs. Besides, he saw bears all the time, depending on whose house he was at on certain days. To this day, he still is uncertain about what the creature was he saw that day. However, he has learned to keep his encounter to himself and not telling anyone he knows in person about what he saw. He goes on to say that similar sightings have been reported by others in his community. As for his friend, his family hastily returned to California less than a month after the incident. The friend never spoke to any of the friends he made in Tennessee, the OP included, ever again. If they went to his house, the door either remained unanswered or his mother would promptly run them off. A couple of years later, the OP moved up north and left the incident behind, telling only people he knows from his hometown and now those who read it on the internet. In response to a comment, he gives further information about the running style of this creature and a more detailed description of its face. He says it didn't run on all fours for an extended period, and that its running style was more akin to that of a dog with a fluid and sloped movement, rather than the lumbering gait of a bear. Its movements were more graceful. He also says it ran on two legs as well. This revelation led him to ponder whether he should compare this creature to an animal or a human. However, the running style could also be attributed to a large primate. To investigate further, he dedicated some time to watching clips of all the large animals native to the area, as well as those known to occasionally venture onto the mountain. He then compared their running styles to that of primates. However, after conducting some quick searches, he found himself with more questions than answers. But he does believe that he and his friend encroached upon this thing's territory and it was trying to scare them off. He goes on to talk about the creature's face, saying that it was covered in fur and possessed a peculiar blend of animal and humanoid features. It seemed to possess the facial mobility required to express human-like emotions, yet it always retained an animalistic appearance. At the time of his posting, he was taking a trip to his hometown and he planned to revisit the location where the encounter took place, saying he would really like to figure out what this creature was, as his curiosity was really getting the best of him. Unfortunately, though, there are no further posts or updates detailing his trip or returning to that area. I've heard a lot of Sasquatches being described as having human-like features, especially in their faces. In fact, I've heard quite a few stories where they are described as big hairy people, more human-like in appearance rather than the ape-like creatures we think them to be. The only thing that throws me off here definitely thinking that this was a Sasquatch is how the OP describes it running on all fours, and that it ran like a canine. This makes me think Dogman, but the way he describes the face doesn't fit. If it had been a Dogman, the OP would have said the face looked like a dog. Maybe a Sasquatch can drop down and run on all fours, but being that they are physically shaped like humans, would they be able to do so as fluidly as he described it doing in this story? And would they look like a canine in doing so? I'm not going to venture a guess as to what this creature could have been. Instead, I'd like to hear what you have to say about it. Was this a Sasquatch or something else? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.